OnePlus 6 versus iPhone 10, the full camera comparison. I'll be awarding the phone that wins each category with 1 point, so let's see which one takes it. Okay, rear camera, and starting things off with straight up 4K video. And for this, we're looking at just colors and dynamic range so far. Both shoot at 4K 60 for silky smooth footage. Just take this in. You'll notice the OnePlus 6 is slightly warmer and a fair bit more saturated. I'd say the warmth is pleasant during the day, but you could argue the saturation is a tad excessive. As you know, the iPhone has quite a distinctive true-to-life signature, and when you've used this phone enough times, you'll be able to identify footage taken from it from a mile away. The OnePlus color profile also keeps the entire image looking sharp. Take a look at the tall building in the background here. On the iPhone, it looks pretty washed out. Moving into slightly lower lighting, you can see the OnePlus start to have a little trouble. Whilst it does render the color of the orange juice about right, it is much more affected by the lack of surrounding light, and its warm color profile is almost acting against it now. The iPhone 10 on the other hand stays consistent, still capturing a natural, accurate clip of what is happening. If we go one step further, the warmth issue with the OnePlus is exacerbated. To give you an idea, the iPhone is a good example of how the scene actually looked, and side by side the OnePlus looks like a red mess. Because this phone has this preset color profile of warmth plus saturation, and no color temperature sensor like the P20 Pro to adjust this depending on the condition, warm lighting isn't this phone's best friend. Notice though, the OnePlus retains far more detail on that billboard to the right, indicative of a better dynamic range, but we'll loop back to this. Also in favour of the OnePlus is the lack of noise. The iPhone 10 has this very grainy look to it, and because of the wider aperture of the OnePlus, it can allow more light in and prevent this happening. And you could argue that whilst colours can be somewhat corrected, this noise cannot, and therefore this is even more important. Alright, quick thing on a bit of a side note, I do have a 5 smartphone giveaway happening on my Instagram right now, so if you did miss that, be sure to check it out, link is in the description below. Both phones have optical image stabilization in their primary lenses. The iPhone 10 also has it in its second lens, and that's benefit will become clear when we talk about zooming. But OnePlus actually handles walking a little better, only marginally though. Both have a pretty hard time stabilizing when you're moving at 4K 60. So whilst OIS helps, it by no means invalidates the use of a smartphone gimbal for smooth footage. OnePlus 6 again takes the lead in high dynamic range. It keeps the building straight ahead in its full detail, whereas on Apple, it's starting to disappear into the sky. You'll notice again how OnePlus has strongly boosted the blues and the reds, which has resulted in a simple cityscape like this looking really punchy. At 1080p, whilst both phones are noticeably more stabilized, the same story is true. OnePlus takes the lead, and again, look how it managed to keep the detail in the sky too. iPhone 10 has a more advanced focusing system, and you'll notice this pretty quickly. Not only can it find its focus faster on slim objects or items that are moving while you're recording, but the OnePlus struggles to keep them in focus, whilst the iPhone has no issues at all. Slow motion video. Both can take 1080p video at 240 frames per second, and the quality is very comparable. Looking at the building on the right, you can see the noise on the OnePlus is a tad more noticeable, but at the same time, the general image on the 6 is sharper. And OnePlus here also has the option for 720p footage at 480 frames per second, which crops into the picture so the angle is less wide. The quality is noticeably lower, but it's nice to have the option for this because continuous 480 frames per second footage is very high, and of course the more frames you're recording, the more you can slow down this video. More of a warning than anything else, no smartphone thus far can produce high quality slow-mo in low light. Unfortunately, these two phones over here are no exception to the rule. You'll often notice flickering lights due to the frame rate of the recording, and enough noise to make the footage pretty unusable. What about the front camera, something that rarely gets talked about? In terms of video, both shoot 1080p at 30 frames per second. And like with the super slow-mo, OnePlus crops into the sensor, which on one hand enables it to achieve much better stabilization, but it comes at the cost of this very narrow angle, which means if you did want to fit many people in the frame, you'd have to hold the phone much further away. Now OnePlus also involves some face mattification, but not in a crazy way. You're not mutated into a Barbie doll like with some smartphones, but it does quietly make you look better. In photos, OnePlus 6 continues the trend of producing flattering images that make your skin look smooth without being too unnatural. Detail on the OnePlus on paper should be much higher, but in reality you run into sensor limitations way before resolution limitations, and in a lot of cases, Apple actually takes it. Weirdly, and in contrast to the rear camera, it has a cooler color temperature versus the iPhone, which on balance is probably a positive, and in very low light, due in part to its wide aperture, exposes the face a little better, compared to the darker looking image of the iPhone X. Okay, photos, and we'll start on a surface level, and then we'll get into the nitty gritty. Whilst video on the OnePlus is doused in a heavy color filter, the opposite is true for photos. Its images have a natural look, which is totally fine, but just leads to a slightly disconnected, inconsistent color experience. It has gone from far more saturated than the iPhone in video to slightly less saturated than the iPhone in photo. OnePlus is much faster at detecting HDR scenes. These two photos are from both phones, left to auto-detect for 3 seconds. Whilst all areas of the OnePlus image are clearly visible, the iPhone hasn't quite clicked that this requires HDR mode, and so has completely lost detail in the bright part of the image. And this is something I noticed time and time again. When it does detect the scene though, the iPhone's is on a technical level the slightly better image. It managed to keep the bright background visible whilst keeping the relatively dim foreground as well lit as possible. An interesting tidbit is that whilst the iPhone X has a wide angle and a telephoto lens, the new OnePlus 6 just has 2 regular fixed focal length lenses. What this means is you get no optical zoom, so unlike the iPhone, you can't zoom into a frame with minimal quality loss. So both phones have that little 1x, 2x button to zoom in and out, but with OnePlus, you'll find obvious degradation in image quality. Also, the iPhone X has dual OIS, meaning both lenses are optically stabilized, so even when you're using its telephoto lens to zoom in 2 times, you've got that mechanism to reduce the impact of shaking. This caveat makes the comparison all the more interesting. If we take a straight up detail shot of the floor and crop in 8 times, OnePlus wins consistently in detail, but using the 2 times zoom first and then cropping in, the iPhone X is far more detailed. Moving into lower light, the OnePlus does have that slightly wider aperture, and this is where you feel it. Photos have a crisper finish when there's minimal light around. Apple's phone gets a little soft around the edges as its shutter speed slows down more than the OnePlus's in the absence of much light. Super low light though is a little more mixed. Both obviously lose most of the details, but Apple manages to maintain a natural color palette compared to OnePlus that goes overboard on the cool tones. This image is a great reminder though of the consistently broader dynamic range capabilities of the OnePlus, and low light isn't an exception to this rule. Notice though how the iPhone manages to retain a bit more of the natural color when there is no light around. Looking at that orange in the top right, the iPhone retains not only more of its surface texture, but also the hue of the fruit. Okay, speaking of super low light like this brings us to the rarely answered question of flash quality, to which you might know that the iPhone X comes packing a quad flash module, compared to the dual flash on the OnePlus 6. But with OnePlus, light actually fills a broader area, but it is less subtle. It creates harsh color and contrast, but as it is technically doing a better job at illuminating a scene, it is personal preference as to which one wins. In this case, I'd side with the iPhone though, because the softer light will generally work better with faces. In some ways, the most important area, detail. And the reason I've saved it till the end is because the detail you get in an image is a combination of many of the aspects we've already been looking at. Resolution is important, but also pixel size. Larger pixels means less noise in the photos. Now, this new OnePlus 6 has a sensor that is 19% larger than its predecessor, which has resulted in a pixel size of 1.22 micrometers, exactly on par with the iPhone X. So, with an identical pixel size and higher resolution, the OnePlus 6 on paper should produce more detailed shots. Thankfully, I could say that does translate into what actually happens. Cropping into these outdoor shots, it's not even close. If you're planning on printing photos or blowing them up to a large size, you'll notice the improved quality of the OnePlus. On the other hand, if, like most people, you keep photos on your phone and really only view them on the phone's display, this detail difference is going to be hard to notice. Last but not least, portrait mode, and both phones have the option, and this is just about the only function of the OnePlus 6's second camera. But even then, I'm so glad it's there. Edge detection is fantastic on both phones, but the iPhone has to zoom in to take portrait shots, which more often than not is actually an annoyance. Furthermore, providing you're not going into super low light, OnePlus 6 portrait mode holds up better as the light starts to dim, which was a surprise to me. Okay, these scores, whilst obviously not conclusive in their own right because different categories carry different weights, are indicative. They're indicative of these two phones trading blows, where the OnePlus 6 might win in one category, the iPhone 10 will win in another, and so on and so forth. And this is telling in its own right because, well, just take a look at the prices. In most markets, the OnePlus 6 is half or even less of the price of the iPhone 10. And whilst yes, it's true, the iPhone 10 is Apple's 2017 flagship and will be replaced this year, we could be waiting another 4, 5, 6 months for that to happen. So in the meantime, the OnePlus 6 is the true winner of this test, considering its price. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. Don't forget to check out the giveaway that I'm running on Instagram. Link is in the description below. With that being said, my name is Aaron, this is Mr. Who's the Boss, and I'll catch you guys next time.